Hi, welcome to my ride home. So, in my last vlog, we talked some more about dystopia and about metaphors, and I gave my own metaphorical interpretation of Terminator, where basically I said Skynet was Jesus. So, there you go. And in that video, I stated that it does not matter. Basically, I said it doesn't matter whether or not the creators of Terminator intended for that metaphor to be drawn or not. It is possible to look at a work and see a metaphorical interpretation that the creator of that work did not put into it. And I want to talk a little bit more about that because that is not a new concept. So there you go. And, one of the things that I want to do when I talk about movies and books and whatnot is to have, companion videos that talk about theory. And so that's what we're going to do today. And bear in mind, when I say text or work, I may refer specifically to book or to movie, but this can be applied to any kind of work with artistic intent behind it. So this would be books, this would be movies, this would be television shows, this would be music, any kind of visual art, paintings, sculptures, anything like that. It would also include video games. The idea of video games as art is controversial in some circles, though I think that is getting better. I think there have been a lot of games, most especially coming out from indie creators, that really show where there is definitely room for art in the video game medium. So, what we're going to talk about right now can be applied in any of those. But today's topic is not something that is a universal absolute, much like a lot of literary theory that we're going to talk about. So let's dig into it. We are going to be going into the realms of post-structuralism and postmodernism. I will talk in more detail about these topics later, because I like postmodernism as a concept and as a lens for evaluating art. But it is not something that is always presented very well. I noticed this when I first got exposed to the concept by name when I was in college. And some of my fellow students, I could definitely tell who was going to be a future Jordan Peterson fan. But even my professors didn't necessarily present it clearly. So when I actually sit down to talk about postmodernism and post-structuralism, I want to really have my ducks in a row for that. I want to give a nice, clear presentation so that you can come away with a clear understanding of what these are and how I utilize these concepts when I am using them for analysis. So there you go. one of the most important things, and we're going to touch on this here momentarily, we are not talking about the erasure of meaning. So that is something that gets laid at postmodernism's feet by its critics, and it's not true. At least it is not true in the way that critics say it is true. And we're going to come back to this, so just hang in there with me. Right, so we're delving into postmodernism, into the realms of postmodernism and post-structuralism. What are those things? Well, if you have not guessed yet from the title, then we are talking about death of the author, and we are talking about reader response criticism. Both of these things, they are not the same, but they do go hand in hand. They did come about around the same time period in the 1960s is when both of these ideas came to the forefront and saw development and saw people picking up on them. They are important still to how we do criticism today. Neither one of these things are something that is ignored. But they are complicated, especially in our modern media environment, where you can have somebody like, say, John Green, who is an author, who also has a social media platform where you can engage with him very easily, and he will engage back with you. And that makes ideas like death of the author interesting. So, yeah. So what is death of the author? Well, death of the author comes from an essay of the same name by Roland Barthes, where he basically declares that. To boil it down, very simple, the idea of death of the author is a way to separate the text and a meaning of the text from the author and the time of the author. Up until that point, there was a lot of focus on the author and who the author was, the times the author lived in, what was known about them and their views and their relationships, most especially if they had things like powerful patrons, or had, strong working relationships with other authors and whatnot. So, and basically death of the author is a pushback to the importance of focusing on those things. And basically with death of the author, you are looking at a focus away from the author as the catalyst or origin of meaning for a text, and you are looking at the text itself and the reader for that meaning. It is a decentralization of meaning. It is, as I said, a very postmodern and post-structural concept, because you are talking about, let's back up a second. So if you have a work like, say, Twelfth Night by William Shakespeare, and from a more traditional perspective, you are going to be looking at meaning, and you are going to be looking at what Shakespeare intended to go into the text. you're going to be making a couple of assumptions. One, that what you know about Shakespeare is in fact correct, which may or may not be the case depending on when and how you learned about Shakespeare. What I learned about Shakespeare in middle school and high school, for example, is a bit different from what I learned about Shakespeare by the time I got into college. And it is different from what my children are going to learn about Shakespeare, because of the age difference with my children. My oldest and my youngest are may still learn different things about Shakespeare. So it makes assumptions that, one, that the information that you have about the creator of a work is going to be correct when you are using that information for interpretation. And then it assumes that the language of the text is going to have a set universal meaning, a transcendental meaning, if you will. And that is not always true. We will draw back to etymology for an example of what I mean. If you take a word like awesome or wondrous, these are words that have a connotative meaning now that was not the case when that word was first used. Incredible would be another example. Words change slightly in how we use them over time. So, you can have words like awesome that had one meaning when the word first came into being, and it has a different connotative meaning now, but it is still the same word. My least favorite example of this would be the word literally, that for so long people misused, that it now has a meaning of being figurative, which is literally the exact opposite meaning of the word. The meaning of words changes over time, whether we like it or not. So to say that a word or a phrase, or even a meter in a poem has a transcendental meaning is not necessarily going to hold true forever. So there you go. And basically Death of the Author picked up on this and said, okay, well, since transcendental meaning does not necessarily hold up, we are going to just go, we don't really care what the author intended. It does not matter. What matters is the meaning that can be drawn out of the text now. Basically, the unity of a text, where it converges for meaning with the reader, is not in where it was created, but where it ends up in the mind of that reader. I personally like Death of the Author. This is a concept that gets misapplied. I like it because one of the things that I do like when I get to experience it is when somebody I know reads something and they tell me some meaning that they took out of it that they authentically found. Not something that I told them that was there, but something that they found, something that spoke to them. And sometimes it is something I intended, but not always. I have had people read a story and come back to me and go, hey, is this thing? And I'm like, I can totally see where it is. I wasn't even thinking about that. So it's really interesting. It is seeing how a text and a reader interact together. And when it is a text that you have created, it's just, to me, fascinating. That is neat to me. As a critic and analyst, I like Death of the Author because you don't necessarily have access to the author to find out what they mean, and it would be kind of ridiculous to me to limit myself only to what an author says something is. And maybe it's my postmodernism showing, but it just seems to me that you can pull a lot of meanings out of things depending on how you are looking at something. So being able to do so. And really, the idea of Death of the Author is very helpful to a lot of the literary theories that we'll discuss on this channel, and in these videos. When I am, if I'm going to look at something through a Marxist lens, as I've said before, I may be looking at something through a Marxist lens that was not written by somebody who is themselves a Marxist and who may not have been considering Marxism at all. And that does not necessarily mean that I'm going to be looking at that thing as supporting Marxism. It just means that there is something that I pick up on and I go, I think Marxism has something to say about this. The same with feminism, or with cultural studies, or with historical studies, with moral criticism. So any of these lenses that I can use to examine a text are not necessarily going to be a lens through which the creator or creators of those texts had in mind when they created them. So, being able to go, well, we don't care what the author intended, is important for different modes of criticism. But it does get misused. One of the ways it gets misused is when you find out that somebody you like is not a good person, and you want to keep liking the media that they produce, but you don't want to feel bad about it because of what they've done. And we're going to be honest here for a second. If a story speaks to you, whether it is a book or a video game or a movie or a television show, whatever it is, if it speaks to you, it speaks to you for a reason, and it should speak to you with its own voice. It does not have to speak to you through its creator, because honestly, its creator is not really what's speaking to you. If you are moved by the plot of a book, by a scene in a video game, by the scenery of a movie, whatever. It is the function of that text itself that's moving you. Yes, somebody created it and somebody put all that stuff together, or some people put that stuff together, but it is the text itself that is creating that emotion and drawing that emotion from you and establishing that connection. It is okay to like something, even if the person who made it is the most horrible, crappy person in the world. What is not okay is to ignore what somebody may be doing with their platform. And as a society, if somebody with a powerful platform does something bad, we are responsible for holding them responsible for it. So there you go. Don't declare the author dead just so that you don't have to look at something difficult to look at. Take the time to look at that difficult thing, and a fan of somebody's work can be a very powerful voice for holding them accountable, because that voice is, yes, I recognize the great thing that this person does, and it touched me in a special way, but they did something bad and they need to be held accountable for it. That is actually a very powerful statement. And that is a statement that can help people who are victimized by somebody who has power. So don't be afraid to make that statement. Really, don't be afraid to make that statement. There are people, when things happen, that need you to make that statement. So there you go. Death of the author can be ignored for bad reasons too. I have seen people, when talking about problematic aspects of a work, sometimes people will rely on the diegesis of the work, the narrative world, and what is said to be in existence there, as a way to justify the problematic thing being there, and ignore that problematic thing has an impact on, readers and an audience, and it feeds into a culture around the audience that is consuming it. I have also seen the author invoked in order to defend problematic aspects. A really good example of this is H.P. Lovecraft. There are problematic elements to H.P. Lovecraft's stories sometimes, a lot of times. And there is a lot of inherent racism that can be found without looking very hard in some of his works. And rather than address and discuss these things, I have seen people shut that down by going, well, it was just the time that the author was living in. If you're going to resurrect the author, don't resurrect the author for bad reasons. Don't kill him for bad reasons. Don't bring him back to life for bad reasons. It's not good. Those problematic aspects can still be addressed and discussed, and the work can still be enjoyed. So there you go. So that is Death of the Author. I might have rambled a little bit, so please forgive me. The other concept that very much plays into what we talked about in the last video is reader response criticism. Like I said, this also came about in the 60s. It's when it started gaining its traction and its formation and whatnot. And reader response criticism is basically what it sounds like. It takes away meaning of a text from an author and places it in the hands of a reader. Death of the author is is more like a tool than a concept of literary theory itself. Death of the author would be putting on the blindfold. Reader response criticism would be would then be picking up the stick and hitting the piñata. So there you go. That's about the best way I can explain the relationship. So, especially since I'm about to repeat a lot of what I just said when I talked about Death of the Author. Because Death of the Author is very important to reader response criticism. Basically, reader response criticism says that there is not a meaning in a text until a reader engages with that text. Literally, a book is just words on paper until somebody reads it. And then when they read it, they put meaning into it. And that is the essence of what I did with my reading of Terminator in the last video. For reader response criticism, the two most important points is that the reader is not passive and that they cannot be separated from meaning and the creation of meaning of a text. If you have not guessed, we are still very much in the realm of post-structuralism and postmodernism, because we are not talking about centralized meaning. We are talking about meaning that is individual to each reader. Two readers can sit down and read the same text and draw different meanings from it. That's the whole point of reader response criticism. Reader response criticism will also look at other critics and what they are saying and what kind of meaning other people are drawing from it. The most important thing is that the meaning comes from the intersection of the text and the reader. It is not just the text itself. There is not a transcendental meaning to the words and the phrases and the cadence and whatever. There's not a transcendental meaning. The meaning is whatever meaning that the reader draws out of it. And one of the things, much like with Death of the Author and how Death of the Author can assist other theoretical lenses when examining art, you can do a reader response reading of a text in almost any critical lens. So, and for much the same reason that, Death of the Author helps with those theories, because you are going to be looking at a text not necessarily in the same mode and same framework that the creator of that text was operating under when they wrote it. So there you go. It's kind of hard to say anything more about reader response criticism without just repeating myself, ad infinitum from everything that I said about Death of the Author, because both of these things do go very much hand in hand. Don't ask me which one came first. When I was doing some reading up, everything was, Death of the Author leading to reader response. But, I don't want to say that and then, get corrected by a scholar in the comments, because that would just be embarrassing. So, but they do go hand in hand, and these are both theories that do function with other critical theories very well. So, there you go. But they are not absolute. This is a different world than it was in the 1960s, for one, and probably the most important thing. But even without the internet, it is possible to have texts that an author does not have to have a large, internet platform a la John Green, where, people can interact with them on a regular basis. They do not have to be, a J.K. Rowling who will, go back and add new stuff to finished text constantly. In order for death of the author to maybe not be so much dead as maybe in a slight coma or just sleeping. Maybe buried alive, but with a bell so that, they can ring the bell and you know that they're alive and can dig them out. Historical references. So, there's a book that I will talk about at some point. It is one of my favorite books in the world, and I highly recommend, if you have not read it, going and reading it, reading some of this author's other stuff. The book is called Erasure. It is by an author named Percival Everett. He is an African-American author, and he is just an excellent storyteller. He has got just a great voice when he tells stories. He is clever and imaginative, and just crafts stories that will draw you into them, and he will make you feel, the characters on his page. I love his work. Erasure is one of my favorite stories. I was introduced to it in college and completely fell in love with it. LeVar Burton does a reading, and I'll put a link to it after I get this video up and can, manage my description. But LeVar Burton did a whole bunch of readings, and you can find them on YouTube, and I really suggest doing it because they're really good. But he does a reading of another of Everett's short stories. Erasure is a novel, but it's not a very long novel, and it is a somewhat dense read in some ways, but it is a very good read. It is metafiction, though, and metafiction is one of those places that Death of the Author can be tricky. If you do not know what the term means, metafiction is essentially fiction about itself. That does not mean that there is not other meanings in it, but the easiest way to explain it is to tell you what Erasure is about, because it is probably one of the best examples that you will find of this, at least in book form, that I have found. Erasure is about a man who is an academic writer. He is also African American, and it is about his struggle for recognition as a writer, as well as struggles with things that happen in his personal life. And it is a book very much about what it is to be a writer, and identity, and just, it is really powerful. And please bear in mind how I introduced the book to you. It is a book by an African American writer. People of color do not have a proportional representation in literature a lot of times, compared to, their representation in population. And so the book opens, and he is in a bookstore, and he is noticing that I think that he is pondering the fact that his latest book is not selling well. And he notices that instead of being in the academic section of the bookstore, it is in the African American section because he is an African American author. And the problem is that the book is not like any of the other books in the section. It is academic writing. And most people who are going to be going to the African American section to get a book by an African American author are not also looking for academic fiction, or academic work rather, because it wasn't fiction. I can't remember right now what it was that he wrote. I just know it was academic writing. And so, he's like, it needs to be here. And then of course there's the problem that when it's, with other academic writings, that very often it gets overlooked because he's African American. So, it's kind of a catch-22, but it's a catch-22 exacerbated by trying to categorize the writing by his identity. So it's very fascinating, and this is, the opening salvo of the book, and pretty much is very much, it is setting very much the stage for the rest of the book. It's a really fascinating read, and it is very meta, and it is very, very hard to look at that book and do a reading of it without considering the author himself, especially, considering the representation of people of color in literature and in different genres. So, there you go. So that is a place where you can't wholly kill the author in looking for meaning, because it is written in such a way that it is very much, while not autobiographical, it is still very much the experience of the author. So death of the author is not an absolute thing, but it is a useful thing depending on how you need to interpret a work and depending on the work that you are wanting to interpret. And the same goes for reader response criticism. I can look at erasure in a reader response lens, but I'm only going to be able to look at that so far, because again, it's metafiction, and it is written in such a way that it begs for interpretation in light of who its author is. So, it's just a perfect example of how important it is to be able to be flexible in how you consume media, and to be versed in different lenses to consume media, because there is only so much meaning that I would be able to get if I were to look at erasure as a reader response reading, but did not also take into account cultural studies and racial and the experiences of the author in looking at this book. So there you go. Like I said, it's a book that I will talk about more another time. I think I have gotten through everything that I wanted to talk about with Death of the Author and reader response criticism. They're both really interesting. They, we'll touch on postmodernism again another time, because there are lots of things to postmodernism, and I really do think that what I'm probably going to do is, instead of just giving you one info dump about postmodernism and about post-structuralism, that I will probably give you bits and pieces, elements of them, because I think it will be easier to give a whole picture of these things by demonstrating their elements. I think that would be a better way of understanding them. So, here you've got one that, by focusing on the reader rather than the author, that there's so much more meaning that can be garnered, and taken from a work. We are not saying it has no meaning, just that it has meaning other than what it was written under. So, there you go. Thank you very much for sitting through my discussion on Death of the Author and Reader Response Criticism. I hope that it was entertaining. I hope that the sun was not too weird today. And if you like this video, please like, share, subscribe. I am on Twitter. I do have a page on Facebook. I have a blog. I'll try and get links to all those things in the description. I will also be putting some links for further reading. Just quick reads and a couple of videos that also talk about these things. And go into a little bit more detail on some of these concepts and additional examples. And that's it. Peace.